Hey everyone, welcome back to my channel. In this video, I'm going to be continuing the conversation on how and why the church invented hell. Now by hell, I mean the version of hell we find today in Christianity, the place of eternal conscious torment in the afterlife for sinners. This version of hell that we find today in Christianity is a post-biblical version of hell. It's a post-biblical doctrine of hell that was formed in the early centuries of Christianity. And so in today's video, I'm going to be discussing in depth really how that was formed, how it became popular, how it became systematized, and how it really became established as a core pillar of the Christian faith. Now in my previous video, I talk a little bit about this towards the end, but really in the beginning of that video, I went into the four words a little bit. I talked about this a little bit. The four words in the Bible that have been translated to the English word hell. And those four words are the Hebrew word is Sheol, and then it's the Greek word Hades, then the Greek word Gehenna, and then the Greek word Tartarus. And what I talk about is how those four words, none of them mean what hell means in Christianity today. And so the English word hell being translated for all four of those words is a mistranslation. And so I kind of talk about that a little bit. I talk about that even more in my video, Is Hell for Real? So if you haven't seen that, please go back and watch it. But today in this video, I wanted to focus more on the early church and how this version of hell was formed by the church and how it became so popular and how it really had a major impact on the belief structure and the core tenets and the creeds that were being formed during the 4th century and really 5th century. So to begin, I want to start off in the very beginning of Christianity. And so when Christianity was being formed in the 1st century after the original Jesus movement, there was not this is a misunderstanding. This is a misconception that I had for so many years. I used to think that from the time of Jesus until now, there's been this one unified Orthodox Christianity, and then there were other Christianities, or there were other Christian groups that were heretics that were always like, opposing the mainstream Orthodox Church. But that's not how it was at all, because for the first 3 centuries of Christianity, of the Jesus movement, there were many different Christianities, there were many different groups, and there was not this one unified Christian church that started from the time of Jesus and has always been the same and has always been the Orthodox Church from the very beginning. So that belief is incorrect. And so again, for the first 3 centuries, we don't have that. We have many different Christian groups. We have Christianities, and they all believe differently, and they disagree on a lot of things. And some of the things they disagreed on was God and the God of the Hebrew Bible and following the Mosaic Law, whether or not that was something that should still be done. And a lot of their disagreements were on Jesus, so Christology. And so most of these Christian groups believed in the divinity of Jesus, but they didn't really know how that worked, and they kind of disagreed on what that meant. And so how did that work with God the Father, and what about the Holy Spirit? And so this is where a lot of the Christian groups started to really get into some serious debate and arguments on the divinity of Jesus. And one of the biggest ones was some of these groups were denying the humanity of Jesus. And so this is what a lot of the early councils and creeds were focused on. And this was really the main purpose, or the main topic of discussion during the Nicene Creed in 325 AD. And they addressed the Arian controversy during this council. And so this is the reality of early Christianity. It's very complex. There is no unified Orthodox group until the 4th century, when one particular group begins to merge with the Roman Empire, Nicene Christianity, and then all of a sudden this one group starts to form a quote-unquote orthodoxy, and then this particular group and the bishops that are leading this group get to decide for everyone else now what is right, calling it orthodoxy, and what is wrong, calling it heresy. And they were backed by the political power of the Roman Empire, so they had a lot of power and influence and control. And after the time of the 4th century, really any other Christian group that was competing with the Nicene Christianity started to fade away because they just couldn't compete with the size and the power and the political influence of the Roman Empire. And so during this time, this is 4th century, this is really when this idea of hell, this place of eternal punishment, started to become something that was used almost as like a scare tactic, for any other group or any other Christian that was going against the quote-unquote orthodoxy. And so they were deemed heretical, like I said, but then what they were told as the heretic was that if you continue to believe whatever you believe that's going against our orthodoxy, then you are going to end up in hell forever. So it was a scare tactic. But even before the 4th century, when this all started, we do start to find hell and eternal conscious torment in a lot of the writings of the heresiologists like Tertullian and Irenaeus. And so in their polemic writings, they're writing about these other Christian groups and these other Christians that, again, just believe differently. But because they believe differently, because these other Christians disagree with the theology or the Christology of whoever the theologian is that's writing these polemic writings, they are deemed heretical. And during this time, well, before I get to that, let me say this. So they're deemed heretical, and then in these polemic writings of Tertullian and some of the other church theologians and church fathers that were writing these polemic writings, we start to read about eternal conscious torment, mainly for the heretic. And so this is when it starts, really 2nd century, 3rd century, but then by the time of the 4th century, when this one group is becoming mainstream and they're gaining power and control and influence, then they start to use that as well. And now that they have this enormous power, it's working even better for control and to continue to grow in size and power. And that's exactly what happened. And what's happening is these church theologians and fathers and bishops that are starting to use this against the heretic, which, remember, the heretic, the quote-unquote heretic, is just the person or the group that disagrees with the mainstream orthodox, quote-unquote orthodox church. And so anyone that went against the system, anyone that went against the empire, was now a heretic, and heretics were now being severely persecuted and excommunicated. And they were being told that if they don't submit to the authority of the church, of the Orthodox Church, and if they don't adhere to all these creeds and doctrines, then they were going to hell, and they would face eternal conscious torment. And so hell was not just for the sinner, it was not just for the wicked during this time, it was for the Christians and the Christian groups that were deemed heretical, that were going against the mainstream system of the Orthodox Church. And so in a lot of these writings of these church theologians and heresiologists that are writing this stuff, a lot of times they are quoting scripture, and they're using the Bible now, and they're using these specific verses like in Revelation and in Matthew 25, any kind of judgment passages or anything that has to do with fire that they're reading about. They're using the Bible, so they're imposing their own view of the afterlife onto the biblical text. And really, the Bible was canonized between really the 2nd and 4th century. So that was a progress. That was something that happened over time. But they had access to what became the biblical scriptures, but also the scriptures that did not make it into the canon. And so they were reading all these different scriptures, and they were using these passages that were full of Jewish symbolism and allegory and apocalyptic literature. And a lot of these writings were meant to be read through that lens of allegory, or maybe it was a parable, or maybe it was some kind of symbolism, or some kind of apocalyptic literature. Well, it was being taken through this lens of literalism now, and it was being used to support the idea of the afterlife, of this place of eternal conscious torment that was being formed in the early church. And so that had a lot to do with the belief in hell and the construction of this doctrine of hell in the early church. There was that, but then there was also the heavy influence of the Greek and Roman and Egyptian mythology. So all those different traditions and cultures and their version of some kind of hellish experience in the afterlife was also starting to directly influence these church theologians and heresiologists that were writing about this place of eternal conscious torment. And so when I say the church invented hell, I don't mean hell in the sense of some kind of negative experience in the afterlife, because we certainly find that in other traditions that come well before Christianity. And what I'm telling you is that these ancient Greek and Roman cultures and the mythology that came from these different traditions and cultures was directly influencing these early church theologians and heresiologists in their formulation of this notion of hell, along with some of the New Testament scriptures and this imagery of like the lake of fire and all these different sayings and parables that we find in the scriptures. They were being used to support this new idea of this dualistic version of the afterlife, where there's a judgment and then there's eternal heaven, or there is eternal hell. And heaven was for the righteous, it was for the Christians, it was for those that submitted to the church. But hell, eternal conscious torment, was for the sinners, the wicked, anyone who is outside of the church, and it was also for the heretics, even the Christians within the church. And that's something that I'm trying to point out. I'm trying to highlight a pattern that we start to see in the early church, in the first few centuries of Christianity. And then there was these non-canonical writings like the Apocalypse of Peter and the Apocalypse of Paul. And in the Apocalypse of Paul, which I think was written after the Apocalypse of Peter, I think the Apocalypse of Peter was written like 2nd century, and then the Apocalypse of Paul was written around the 4th century. And in the Apocalypse of Paul, there's this very vivid description of this journey of heaven and hell. And what's interesting is that the journey through hell is a lot more vivid, and it's a lot longer than the journey through heaven, the journey through hell is. And so through the journey of hell, there's all these different like specific punishments for certain sins. And so there's this punishment for that sin and that punishment for that sin in hell. And it's horrific, it's gruesome. And then what's really interesting is, as you're reading this, what you find is that some of the worst punishments are for heretics in this particular writing. Well, guess when this non-canonical writing was written? It was written in the 4th century, which was around the same time that this whole notion of hell was becoming formalized and it was becoming systematized, when the Roman Empire was merging with this one particular Christian group, and there was an Orthodox church being formed. This was all 4th century, and this was around the same time that this Apocalypse of Paul was written. And in this Apocalypse of Paul, guess what? In the description of what hell is like in eternal conscious torment, like I'm saying, one of the worst punishments is for heretics. And so this was another major influence for the early church to start using this as just another example of what would happen to anyone or any group within Christianity that went against the orthodoxy, that went against the mainstream. And even with the Apocalypse of Peter, there's also very, very vivid descriptions of the punishments that would take place for sinners and also heretics. And so both of these books, these are non-canonical books. They did not make it into the canon, but they had great influence on the early church, as the early church was influenced by all these different books and traditions and cultures and ancient mythology from various parts of the world. So that's really how it was constructed, and that's how it was really being formed. And then we get to the fifth century. Well, I'll say 4th century, end of the 4th century, beginning into the middle of the 5th century. We have this early church father and theologian by the name of Augustine. And Augustine was very influenced by Platonism, and he also couldn't read Greek, which was a hindrance to him interpreting the scriptures. And so he started to really write about this whole notion of eternal conscious torment in a lot of his writings, like The City of God. And so in The City of God, we find a lot of this notion of eternal conscious torment, not just for the wicked, not just for the sinners, but for the heretics. And when Augustine started to really write about this, this is when it became very popular. And from this point on, this is when the notion of hell as this place of eternal conscious torment for the sinner, for anyone that was not a true Christian, became almost like, it became so popular and it became so established that really, I mean, that was 5th century. And since then, since that point, it has continued to be the dominant view of the afterlife in the church. So for many centuries, for many years, it's been that way. And it all started around the 4th century and 5th century as far as it being established and systematized. And Augustine had a tremendous impact on that. And so from the time of Augustine, really the doctrine of hell as eternal conscious torment and the doctrine of original sin became very popular. And that is why even today in modern Christianity, the doctrine of original sin and the doctrine of hell as eternal conscious torment is still very popular, and it's still considered like a main pillar of the faith. Okay, so that's really how it came to be the way it is today. But this is something that, I'm hoping you start to do your own research on this subject, and you start to study this out for yourself, and you start to do your own homework and ask the questions, because this doctrine of eternal conscious torment was something that was formed. It was something that was created for really the purposes of control and power. And the way to control people is through fear, and the church knew that, and especially being merged with this political power of the Roman Empire. It was known that the way you control people is by scaring them. And so this doctrine of eternal conscious torment, really the whole notion of like the dualistic version of hell where it's eternal, the dualistic notion of the afterlife, where it's the eternal, either eternal heaven or eternal hell. There's a judgment, and then you go to either one of these places. And then if you go to hell, not only is it eternal, but once you're there, you can't get out, you can't escape. That whole understanding, that whole belief of the afterlife that we find today in Christianity was something that was absolutely formed. It was invented by certain members of the early church of Christianity for the purposes of control and power. And so this notion of hell as eternal conscious torment being used as a scare tactic is still something that is very much in existence today. And I was born Catholic, and then I became evangelical. And I remember in both seasons of being Catholic and evangelical, I remember being told that if I don't believe in hell, then I'm going to hell. Because if I don't believe in hell, then I'm not a true Christian. And if I'm not a true Christian, then I'm not saved. And if I'm not saved, then I'm going to hell. And so this was something that I just believed in because I was told I had to believe in it. And then I was told that if I don't believe in it, then I'm going there for eternity. And so, of course, that's the whole point behind it. It's for control. It's for getting as many people as possible to join the one and only church, the one and only Christianity. And for those who choose not to join, for those who think differently, it's to instill fear into those people so that they do end up joining. And, again, this is something that started in the first few centuries of Christianity, and it is still very much in existence today. But my encouragement to you is this. You don't have to believe in it. And I'm telling you this from experience. I'm telling you this from my own journey. And my encouragement to you is to not just believe something because someone is telling you to believe in it, especially if they're telling you something to believe in and there's some kind of condition attached to it, and then there's some kind of threat of eternal damnation if you don't believe in whatever they're telling you. If that's the case, then you definitely need to question it. You definitely need to be skeptical, and you need to do your own research. And if you start to think for yourself and you start to study these ideas out for yourself, and you do the history study, you do the church history study, and you start to recognize these patterns and paradigms of the us versus them mentality, and the heresy versus orthodoxy, and the in group and the out group, and all, these are patterns that happen time and time again throughout history. When you start to recognize all this and you start to see how these doctrines were formed and why they were formed, then you wake up and then you're free, because you realize that none of it's true. There is no place of eternal conscious torment in the afterlife. This is something that was made up. It was invented for control and for power. But you don't have to believe in it. And so that's my encouragement. Do your own homework, do your own research, and discover for yourself what the truth actually is about this subject. Okay? So I think that's it for today. I think I've covered everything that I really wanted to talk more about. Maybe I'll make some more videos on this and I'll continue the conversation. But I'm really interested to hear what you think. So please leave your comments and your questions down below in the comment section. And whether you agree or disagree, I want to hear about it. And I would love to discuss some of these topics with you, or some of these ideas that I mentioned in this video. And yeah, I'm looking forward to it. And if you would like to support this channel, the best way to do so is through my Patreon. And when you subscribe to my Patreon, you get access to exclusive weekly blogs, video teachings, guided meditations, monthly community Zoom calls that will be starting next month, study groups. You get access to Q&A. You get access to, you get a discount for all of my coaching packages, because I'm a spiritual coach and I work with people on spiritual awakening and development and the journey of deconstruction and much more. So you get a lot out of it. And so Patreon is the best way to support me if you're interested in supporting this channel. And if you found this video helpful, informative, or insightful, please leave a thumbs up at the bottom of the screen, and be sure to subscribe to my channel if you haven't already. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.